Hello everyone, this is R.S. Miller at the endtimenews.org, and today is May 19th, 2012. The situation at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in Japan is far from being under control. As a matter of fact, it's a ticking time bomb. Japan is sitting on a ticking time bomb. We're all in a situation of having to pray there's not an earthquake. Experts are warning that Japan isn't out of the woods yet, and the worst nuclear storm the world has ever seen could be just one earthquake away from reality. The troubled Reactor 4 at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant is at the center of the potential catastrophe. A magnitude 7 or 7.5 earthquake would likely fracture the pool, and disaster would ensue, as Arne Gunderson, a nuclear engineer with Fairwind's Energy Education, who has visited the site. Essentially, he said, Japan is sitting on a ticking time bomb. This is a now problem. This is not a let's wait until we get the cash flow from the Japanese government problem. The consequences of a 7 or 7.5 earthquake don't happen every day, but we know it happened last year, so you have to anticipate that it will happen, Gunderson said. We are all in a situation of having to pray there's not an earthquake. And there's the other half of that, which is pray to God but row towards shore. And Tokyo's not really rowing towards shore right now.
Unit 4 has always been my biggest concern. If you watched our website, on the very first week of the accident, I was saying that if Unit 4 were to catch fire, you'd have to evacuate Tokyo. As a matter of fact, the book that we wrote talks about that a lot. It's really important, and it remains the biggest concern that I have about the Fukushima site. Unit 4 has more fuel in it than any of the other units in the complex. But more importantly, it has the most recently used nuclear fuel. And all of that fuel is outside of the containment. So that would make it dangerous enough, except that also, of course, Unit 4 has had a series of explosions and is weakened structurally. Before, it might have withstood a 7.5 earthquake. I believe that the structural damage to Unit 4 is so great that if there is a 7.5 earthquake, it won't withstand it. Here's what would happen if Unit 4 were to crack and the water were to drain out of the nuclear fuel pool. The fuel is hot enough that it needs to be water cooled. And if air is all there is cooling the fuel, it will burn. It will burn the zircaloy cladding on the fuel, will react with the oxygen to create a fire. And it's a fire that once it starts, can't be put out by water. Water would make it worse. So the nuclear fuel would have to burn completely before the fire would ever go out. Now, in the process, all that radiation would go up into the atmosphere and blow all over Japan and all over the world.
In the video, he goes on to say something that's quite astounding. There is as much cesium in the Fukushima Unit number 4 as in all of the atomic bombs that were dropped in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'm sure that by now most people are at least somewhat aware of the dangers of radiation leaking from Fukushima. But what about Chernobyl? There is a short video you guys may want to watch where theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku states, the Chernobyl core is still melting into the earth, may yet hit underground water and create steam explosion. This is really an eye-opening statement. The Chernobyl accident happened some 25 years ago. It's still melting down with no end in sight. Then consider the fact that Fukushima is many times worse and literally threatens to radiate every living thing on the planet. Is it any wonder that fish, birds, and other creatures are dying in such mysterious ways? I hope you guys don't buy the so-called scientific explanations that are being divvied out almost as quickly as the incidents are happening. In my opinion, it's simply a poorly veiled effort to keep the general population from discovering the truth, which is, the Earth is dying. Mystery illness strikes hundreds of flight attendants, causes rashes and hair loss. Are toxic uniforms really to blame, or is it Fukushima? Hundreds of Alaskan airline flight attendants have filed a formal complaint about uniforms that are suspect might be causing their skin rash and develop lesions and their hair to fall out. But based on the timing of the symptoms and their relation to similar symptoms in local marine life and polar bear populations, it appears as though radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster may also be a potential culprit. King 5 News in Seattle, Washington first broke the news about the mystery illness that has reportedly affected at least 280 flight attendants thus far. According to accounts, those afflicted by the condition say they have developed persistently itchy skin lesions, and hair loss, all of which they suspect may have to do with a newer flight uniform that allegedly contains tributyl phosphate, a toxic organophosphorus compound linked to skin problems. Now, the obvious question here would be, why would you develop suits and then issue them out that contain a toxic compound? Unless, of course, you're trying to cover something up. Moving on here, it says, but not everyone is convinced that the uniforms are to blame, including Alexander Higgins, who recently connected the dots to discover a potential link to the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. After comparing the flight attendant's symptoms to those reported on polar bears and marine life in the northwest U.S. throughout the past year, the timing and correlation of the two is highly suspect. Folks, we need to start thinking for ourselves. If in fact we are facing a dying planet, do you think they would let us know? I don't. Now, speaking of things dying, here's another dead fish story. Oklahoma, dead fish washing ashore at Arcadia Lake. It's kind of scary. Edmond, Oklahoma, wildlife officials are trying to determine why dead fish are washing up on the shore at Arcadia Lake. Campers and fishers contacted officials after they noticed some fish belly up in the water Wednesday. When the fish kind of just started popping up like that, it's kind of scary, fisherman David Cox said. A biologist was at the lake taking water samples that will now be sent to the lab. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation said the dead fish all appear to be white bass. The fish were found near the south side of the lake. Fish kills are not that uncommon, but usually they might take place later in the year when it is hot and dry and there is a problem with oxygenation in the water, and that's usually a typical cause, Michael Bergen said, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. It is still unclear what may have killed the fish. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hosea prophecy clearly tells us that God is going to punish the earth by taking away birds, fish, other animals, just dropping dead mysteriously. Read Hosea, I believe it's chapter 4. Now moving on. Plans to strike Iran ready, says U.S.-Israel envoy. U.S. plans for a possible military strike on Iran are ready, and the option is fully available, the U.S. ambassador to Israel said, days before Tehran resumes talks with world powers which suspected of seeking to develop nuclear arms. Like Israel, the United States has said it considers military force a last resort to prevent Iran using its uranium enrichment to make a bomb. Iran insists its nuclear program is for purely civilian purposes. And meanwhile, Israeli elite locks down as Iran attack decision nears. A private door opens from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office in central Jerusalem directly into a long, modestly furnished, half-paneled room decorated with modern paintings by Israeli artists and a copy of Israel's 1948 Declaration of Independence. It contains little more than a long wooden table, brown leather chairs, and a single old-fashioned white projector screen. This inner sanctum at the end of a corridor between Netanyahu's private room and the office of his top military advisor is where one of the decade's most monumentous military decisions could soon be taken: to launch an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program. Time for that decision is fast running out, and the mood in Jerusalem is hardening. Iran continues to enrich uranium in defiance of international pressure, saying it needs the fuel for its civilian nuclear program. The West is convinced that Tehran's real objective is to build an atomic bomb, something which the Jewish state will never accept because its leaders consider a nuclear-armed Iran a threat to its very existence. Adding to the international pressure, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Daniel Shapiro said this week, American military plans to strike Iran are ready, and the option was fully available. You guys can read the rest of this story, and I'll put the links in the box below as usual. Iranian calls for Islamic awakening to destroy Israel. An Iranian official called this week for an Islamic awakening movement to help Palestinian Authority Arabs demolish the Zionist regime, the agency reported. The comments were made at a conference in Tehran in honor of Nakba Day, the Day of Catastrophe, which is what the Arabs call the English date of May 15th, when the State of Israel was reestablished with the Declaration of Independence in 1948. In brief, address at the end of the conference, the official Hossein Shihaslam said, in success of a revolution, three major factors need to play effective roles, and they are the people, the leadership, and the school of thought or ideology. He added, if we wish success for the Palestinians, the existence of these three factors is necessary, as they did exist in the case of the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Shihaslam said, in the near future, the Islamic awakening movement would also swallow the Zionist regime. The first speaker at the conference, according to IRNA, was the PA ambassador in Tehran, Salah Zawawi, who said that the one and only way to soothe the Arabs' pain and agony is the annihilation of the Zionist regime. If anyone doubts that Iran is working to build a nuclear bomb, then the preceding statements should have helped to dissuade that idea. What people in Western nations may not understand is that, according to Islamic law, once land is in the possession of Muslims, it is always Muslim, and they are commanded to do everything within their power to reclaim what was once theirs, no matter how long it takes. Celebrating Nakba Day, the Day of Catastrophe, only serves as a reminder of a perceived injustice. Whether it was actually a real injustice or not doesn't seem to matter at this point. The establishment of the nation of Israel in May of 1948 is the only fuel needed for the political and religious leaders of the Nation of Islam to fan the flames of hatred and anger. The The ultimate goal is to destroy every Jewish person on the planet and to remove the nation of Israel so that its name is no more remembered. As far as the poor Palestinians go, they're simply being used by their own brothers as a rallying cry, cannon fodder. In other words, a means to an end. The Battle of Armageddon starts in the Middle East and is fought over Jerusalem and the Promised Land. I'm not going to get into it here, except to say that as it develops, nuclear weapons will be used at some point during the conflict. Let me read to you what Zechariah says concerning the last days, and in particular, what appears to be a description of the effects of a nuclear blast on the human body. Zechariah 14, 1 through 4, then 12 through 15. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all nations to the battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravaged. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people not to be cut off from the city shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from the east to the west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half towards the south. Now going on to verse 12, and this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, and their tongues shall dissolve in their mouths. It shall come to pass in that day that a great panic from the Lord will be among them. Everyone will seize the hand of his neighbor and raise his hand against his neighbor's hand. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold, silver, and apparel in great abundance. Such also shall the plague on the horse and the mule and the camel and the donkey, and on the cattle that will be in those camps. So shall this plague be. Their flesh shall dissolve from off their bones while they're standing, and their eyes and their tongues will dissolve as well. That sounds very much like what would happen to people and animals that were in the epicenter of a nuclear blast. Friends, it's getting more and more difficult to deny that something strange and unusual is going on. But a simple examination of Bible prophecy and a comparison of current world events should be ample evidence to convince folks that we are living in the last days. Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all expecting the return of their Messiah right around the same time, which is any day now. The Bible gives clear indicators of signs of the times, and we are currently living in that time just before the Lord returns. Believe it or not, we are in the last days. Are you saved? Follow the link below and pray the prayer of salvation with all sincerity, and you will be saved. Jesus loves you all, and it is my prayer that God bless you with an ear to hear, with eyes to see, and a heart to receive. In his mighty name, amen.